Alrighty, everybody, welcome to the third Patreon video for the month of April 2019. And this is a video that I've been trying to, formulate in my head for a very long time. As the title suggests, today I want to sort of explore the idea of whether or not it is possible to seek legal remedy for having been born and thus create a legal caution against people bringing children into the world, because if they do, then they will be on the hook for that, for whatever, their child might need for the rest of that child's life, even as that child grows into be, an adult and everything. And this is actually inspired by an article that I will try to remember to link, although I feel like I say I'll link 2 or 3 things in every video, and then I always forget by the time I'm making the description of the video. But this is actually inspired by an article. I'll link to the BBC News article if I remember. But if I forget, just Google Indian man sues parents. Essentially, there's this Indian man who is suing his parents. He's 27, so 1 year older than me, essentially, probably 28 by now. Well, no, this is only back in February, actually. But yeah, this got me thinking about the idea of whether or not there could actually be a legal challenge to the idea that people should just go around breeding, and that product of breeding ever, truly gains its own independence and ever truly is fully responsible for its own actions. Because it's hard to imagine that for me and a lot of other people, including this guy whose name is Raphael Samuel from India, the guy who again is suing his parents, because, at what point does their obligation cease? At what point does the obligation of the creator become secondary to the obligation of the thing that was created itself? People say that as you get older, you have to, take responsibility for your own actions, but how can you possibly be expected to do that when really the only other option in society, other than taking full responsibility for your own actions? Obviously, if you believe in free will and choice and everything, people have, responsibility for, their own, individual actions. But how do you take responsibility for your whole existence when you never have any say, and the only other option other than take responsibility for your entire existence is to kill yourself, which is socially stigmatized and will land you in a mental institution if you actually opt to try to do it? So you have no choice, essentially, in society. You simply have to exist once you have been made. So how can a person who puts you, or the people who put you in that position, ever abdicate responsibility fully? And I suppose that, this Raphael guy is actually kind of smart in taking his parents to court. It will probably get thrown out, and we're not really going to talk about, whether or not it would, even last in court, because I'm sure that all the old, in this country, old white dudes, and then the old Indian dudes in India, where this gentleman is, are probably not even going to consider. They're probably so, ensconced in the idea of natalism that they probably will not even hear a case like this. I can't imagine what country in the world would. Maybe something Scandinavian, maybe. But what I want to do in this video is jump that sizable hurdle of, imagining how this would ever come before an actual court, and just go through the sort of, plaintiff and defense structure that might be taken in an actual legal argument of, holding parents accountable to their children for bringing them into the world without knowing whether or not they would ultimately enjoy or want to be here. And this argument is going to be structured not around, sterilizing the entire population. That's not what I'm going to be arguing for here. I don't believe that any individual person or group of people is ever smart enough or ever will have the moral clout to say that, people can't breed. I don't think that's like a decision that humanity can make for other people, that human beings can make for other people. I think it's something that people have to take upon themselves as an obligation, and like I have done with my vasectomy, and just refuse to do it. So I think it's an individual struggle that people have to, take for themselves. But so this is not going to be focused on the idea of, sterilizing the entire population before they breed, or, to ensure they have no more children. This is simply going to be structured around allowing children who were created, of course, without consent, because you cannot obtain consent from a conceptual thing that has not been conceived yet. It's going to be structured around allowing children to have some recourse to their parents, and in place of their parents, to the law, although we kind of already have that with social welfare systems. So it's pretty much going to be focused on, as we have in the case of Mr. Samuel from India, allowing children to hold their parents accountable in essentially the only way that matters and the only way they can, which is, monetarily, and, say that, their parents have to, pay. I'm not sure exactly what damages he is seeking in this case. I'm not entirely sure that the BBC article specifies. He essentially, early in the article, they do say that he says we should be paid for the rest of our lives to live. And because there are things like welfare, I assume that he is going after his parents because he expects them to do it, and I would argue rightly so, because they put him here. Anyway, so let's start. I'm going to do a very for the first part of the video, I'm going to do a very structured layout here, as I've got it in my notes here. So essentially, we're going to have counterpoints, or we're going to have a premise, multiple counterpoints, and then we're going to end each idea or each strand of this sort of branching debate tree that I've created with a terminus point, like a part of a conclusion. So it's going to be a little hard to see. For those of you who have the enthusiast here, you'll be able to see it in the notes where it looks a little bit better. But I'm going to try my best to keep this orderly because there are a lot of ideas here. But let's begin then with the premise that childbirth is wrong because consent cannot be obtained, and because life inevitably entails harm in some form. So that's a two-part premise saying that childbirth is wrong because, one, consent cannot be obtained, and two, because life is inevitably going to entail some form of negative experience, harm, trauma, etc. That happens to all people in varying degrees, and I don't think there's any point in, going through, objective proof of that, because everybody has their own trauma, everybody has their own pain, and I don't think anyone, even the most skilled lawyers alive could argue that life is all good. But anyway, counterpoint one to that, or counterpoint A, I should just use what I've written down here. Counterpoint A to that premise: it is impossible to obtain consent from something before its birth. So obviously, when you say, "Oh, consent cannot be obtained, so we shouldn't have children," the first thing people do, as you'll see in the article when you read it, is say, "Oh, well, I could not have sought your consent because you did not exist." So obviously, that's right where people go. So my counterpoint B to that point, to that counterpoint, is that just because consent cannot be obtained, that doesn't mean you simply forge on ahead rather than taking the cautious way. Simply because you cannot obtain something, that doesn't mean you impose your will on it and go do it anyway. It means, or it should mean, I would argue, that you should be cautious and not do it. And then to that, people would say, generally speaking, by this logic, nobody would exist, because if everybody adopted that cautious, that overly cautious, as they would probably argue, stance of not going ahead and having children even though consent cannot be obtained, the human race would cease to exist, because nobody would breed if they were to adopt that caution. And so we reach terminus A now, which is where I say, and kind of where you reach a philosophical impasse, where you say, well, the human race not existing would not be inherently bad. At this point, in order to counter that, you would have to argue legally, in an objective legal way, that human life is objectively good, which you cannot do, as I've said, because everybody has their own individual traumas and all that stuff. But in addition to that, there is objective evidence that human life has an overall negative effect on its immediate surroundings. Consider wars, consider climate change, and just consider all the ways we have, essentially raped the planet of all its resources. And in addition to these sort of bigger issues, all, small individual human happiness is cut short eventually by death. It's temporary. All good is temporary. And, by contrast, the negative impact we've had on other peoples and our planet could be potentially irreversible at this point. And it's unlikely, I admit, that a jury would ever unanimously agree that human life is bad. But I think that it could possibly be convinced, or a jury could possibly be convinced, that there is reasonable doubt that human life is wholly good, or that it is good at all. It is also worth noting at this point that I'm not arguing this as a universal case. Again, I'm not arguing for universal sterilization. While I would enjoy and I would appreciate everybody in the world somehow magically taking up this mantle of, guarding their future generations and their children in the only way they can by not having them and not exposing them to the opportunity for pain. While I really would enjoy seeing that, and I think the world would be, actually, I don't know if the world would be a better place. I don't know if that, the last generation or two would go down in just complete and total chaos and looting and, just an orgy of crazy shit, or if everybody would just say, okay, we're the last human generation and we're going to be, good to each other finally at long last because there's no future and we might as well just go gently into that good night. But I don't know about that, but I'm not making universal case. I'm simply arguing in my individual case, which is essentially rare of, regretting having been born. I'm simply arguing to hold people accountable who are accountable to me in my individual case. Again, there's really, it's kind of a fallacious to appeal to a universal in here because I am making a specific case, and practically speaking, this would not apply to 100% of the human population or even anywhere close to that. But anyway, let's take it back a couple steps and examine another possible counterpoint that I can make. So going back to the first counterpoint to the premise, which is, I say childbirth is wrong because consent cannot be obtained and life entails some harm. And then they come back saying, oh, well, obviously you can't obtain consent, so we should go ahead anyway. I could also argue, instead of saying, well, this doesn't mean we simply forge on ahead, I could take a different tact and say, if we can cause the suffering then of things that cannot consent, then why isn't, let's take it to the extreme and say, why isn't something as horrible as bestiality legal? And then to that kind of absurd argument, they might say, well, bestiality is illegal, but animal agriculture is not. We cause, suffering to animals all the time, and it is allowed. And then we would reach, I think, another philosophical impasse, which I think actually serves me quite well, because I would say, animal agriculture is wrong then. I would counter by saying that we must adopt veganism. And that's the thing, because veganism is actually very hard to dispute from a philosophical standpoint alone. Essentially, the reason that people are not vegans in larger quantities is not any sort of philosophical or ethical reason, because it is philosophically and ethically bunk, I think, to eat meat and participate in the exploitation of animals, and certainly the large-scale exploitation of them in factory farming scenarios. But regardless of the scenario, the specifics of how they're farmed, I think it's unethical. And generally speaking, what I'm getting at here is that if you are not a vegan, it's not because of any sort of philosophical justification or any sort of ethical justification. It's simply because that's what you grew up doing. It's tradition. It's part of your culture in some cases. And because you just don't want to stop eating animal products, and nobody's going to punish you for doing so. That is literally the only reason that more people are not vegans, because, they want to do it. It's allowed. There is no punishment except for, getting cancers and having lactose rip apart your intestines. But anyway, so veganism, if we introduce veganism then to this second sort of point here, this second sort of philosophical terminus, you can employ that to sort of make it very hard to argue against, or argue for causing suffering to non-consenting beings. Because like I said, you really can't dispute veganism unless you adopt a purely anthrocentric or a human-centric speciesist view, wherein humans have ordained stewardship over the world. Simply to say that, it's natural that humans dominate and eat other animals is not in itself a justification, because that's simply invoking the naturalistic fallacy. So you have to objectively say that either some higher power ordained humans to abuse and, mass incarcerate and kill lesser species, supposedly, or you have to say that humans are objectively better than other sentient creatures, and there is no objective scale on which to rate that, because all such attempts at scales would be simply, because they were designed by humans, they would place undue value on, our complex forms of intelligence. And, there is no objective value to that. There is no justification for saying humans are better than animals except pure and total tribalism, and saying, oh, well, this thing looks like me and the other thing doesn't look like me, so I'm going to kill and eat the other thing and, share it with the person who looks like me. So there is no objective philosophical justification against veganism. And honestly, it's bad for the planet. It kills creatures who are indisputably sentient and have a preference not to be in pain. And really, like I said, the only argument for eating animal products is human pleasure. And while pleasure is, of course, philosophically regarded as one of the ultimate human goals, if not the ultimate human goal, pleasure, happiness, whatever you want to call it, pretty much all philosophies have always arrived one way or another at the conclusion that pleasure should not come at the cost of the welfare of other beings wherever possible. And it is certainly possible to live on an animal product-free diet. So by introducing veganism to this antinatalism argument, we actually have a very strong philosophical ally, and say, you arrive at a point here then where we must protect not only animals, but the human animal along with them. So as we realize that the system of animal agriculture is wrong, we must also realize that the system of human cultivation must too be wrong. While we view children, of course, differently than animals, we view them as equals, hopefully, or at least equally human, even if people, think children are ornamental to their lives, in some cases, which is terrible. But, even though we view them as equals, in a sense, many families breed children to the extent that their income and resources will allow, just like farmers breed their cattle to the extent that their space and resources and funding will allow. And then we send our children to educational facilities with the express goal, not of necessarily having them have fulfilling lives, but with the express goal of having them become productive members of society until such time as they have earned enough and, worked enough and paid into the government enough to be allowed to retire financially. Some families even breed to, look at the Trumps. They breed to aggrandize their own image, or they breed to, have laborers to take care of them when they age. Some people genuinely have children for that. It seems absurd now, but especially a few generations back, people would have children just to ensure that there was somebody around when they were older to take care of them. And that to me is cowardly and pathetic. And the key point here is that not only is suffering of some form in life guaranteed, labor in life is also not optional. Because for pretty much everybody except for people who are lucky enough to be born into rich families, you must work to live and to avoid starvation. And this specifically, I think, shores up the financial and the resource aspect of this legal case. It allows you, I think, to seek damages enough to, make life tolerable and as pain-free as can be expected, because you were put in this world without your consent. If it wouldn't be that terrible if you didn't have to struggle and didn't have to experience pain and didn't have to labor. And if we obviously can't, remove the experience of pain from everybody, but I think there should be a legal avenue to remove the struggle and, fight for resources that people have to go through, which is why, again, I think this is, very heavily tied to a financial aspect. But anyway, the conclusion of all this, I think, is that we must either allow all forms of abuse towards non-consenting life forms, or in order to create an ethical society, we must provide all sentient life forms recourse to and protection under the law. For animals who cannot talk, that means we have to have, oversight. We have to have people protecting them and not allow people to just farm them endlessly and turn their entire life into a human resource. A living thing should not exist solely to become, a resource for another living creature, namely humans. But, for humans, this means that not only should they be protected under the law, and of course we already have child abuse laws and stuff like that, but because we can speak and because we can interface with this legal system that we've created in a way that other animals cannot, the human animal should have actual recourse to the law to go to a judge and with a lawyer and say, well, these people put me here and I understand they maybe had good intentions, and, not always true in some people's cases, unfortunately, but let's say it was me. I should be able to go to a judge and say, I understand my parents had good intentions, but the actual execution was terrible and has left me regretting my own birth. These people are accountable to me. They are more accountable to me, and they are more responsible for my existence than anybody else living in the world. I suppose my grandparents are accountable as well, but it's like a second degree or, a twice removed type thing. But, I should be able to seek legal remedy and financial remedy against the people who are directly responsible for my existence because they did not think sufficiently about the risks, and they certainly did not make the right decision about those risks. So the question becomes, if we are allowed to, this is essentially part 2 of the video, if we are allowed to take, our parents to court and hold them accountable for creating us, what is the charge? And honestly, I mean, this is kind of just, it's not really a big deal. You can call it whatever you really want, but I think that it should be some form of homicide or murder. If we define murder as a premeditated, first-degree murder entails premeditation. If we define murder as a premeditated conspiracy to create a scenario wherein a third party or a party other than the conspirators dies, then intentional conception is equivalent to first-degree murder. They premeditated a scenario where I will ultimately die. No matter how good of a life I have, I will still ultimately die. And I suppose by that standard, the idea of accidental conception would be equivalent to manslaughter or negligent homicide, although perhaps in this case we need to invert the severity of the charges here, because premeditation of birth generally means your parents are slightly more prepared and slightly more ready to be kind and giving than in the case of an accidental and unwanted pregnancy. But I mean, again, this is all kind of semantics. The idea is simply that your parents create a scenario wherein no matter how good of a life you have, you will still ultimately die, and they should have been aware of that. And even if you make the argument that you shouldn't charge somebody with murder or manslaughter like this because it constitutes like pre-crime as the death has not yet occurred, then certainly you should still be able to charge them for attempting a murder or manslaughter because the death is guaranteed. Indisputably, the ultimate result of childbirth is always death. There is no chance it will not happen, and I would argue that a very severe punishment is in order. And as far as specifics for that punishment, I think that really, as a parent, your wages need to be garnished. Everything you have, all your property, all your money needs to be given to your children. And, it's not, I know this sounds unreasonable at times, but look at me. I literally put my money where my mouth is. I took the steps to ensure that I would never have a child because I never want to feel this monstrous level of obligation and this monstrous level of guilt. And I never want to, risk creating mortal life and having that life be short and also filled with a lot of pain potentially. So yeah, as severe as it sounds, I'm not asking anybody to do anything, or I'm not philosophizing about anything that I am not prepared to live in accordance with myself. I wouldn't want all my property and all my money, not that I have a whole hell of a lot of that, I wouldn't want all my things to go to a child because they regret being born, but I would have to acknowledge as the person that I am that if I had a child, they would have the right to that if they so chose, and they so elected to, sue me for that, and they elected to, tell me that that's what they deserved, and I wouldn't even have to be taken to court because, philosophically and ethically, I would have to give it willingly. It's not like my beliefs are going to change about this. But yeah, so I took steps to ensure I will never have a child. I will never be obligated to somebody in this way. It was easy, and again, I'm just simply not asking anybody to do anything that I'm not prepared to do myself, or that I haven't done myself, or that I'm not ready to live in accordance with. But back to the whole murder and homicide type thing. Murder has no statute of limitations. I think that's pretty standard everywhere in the world, although I know it's true in the U.S. specifically. So why should the speed of the death matter? Why should it, matter that it takes 70, 80 years for a person to die when they've been created intentionally or unintentionally or what have you? Why should the speed of the death matter when ultimately the same result is death? Is there ever enough goodness, objectively, in a legal sense? Is there ever enough goodness at what point legally, I should say, does the goodness you may or may not experience in life offset the fact that people have doomed you to die? I don't think that point is ever reached, and it would be hard, I think, to legally quantify it. How much, what would you have to put trackers in people's brains and count how many times dopamine gets released or how much dopamine gets released in their whole life to say, oh, well, a release above, this level constitutes a good life, and thus cannot be prosecuted because it was an act of kindness. That would be kind of funny, but also very fucking dystopian and not even technologically possible and probably never will be. So, I don't think the speed of the death matters. And even in the case, if you have a nice life where, you're as a parent, you treat your children well, it's honestly equivalent to kidnapping someone and simply making the room that you hold them in look nice and looking after their comfort and taking care of their needs as much as you can before they die. It's still not right, though. It's still kidnapping, no matter the circumstances of the kidnapping. If I were to kidnap somebody and keep them in my basement, or perhaps not even a basement, not even something dingy and terrible and small. If I were to kidnap somebody and, place them in like a humongous compound, a humongous underground compound that had all sorts of fun stuff in it, like a theme park of life. There's the sex booth, there's the food booth, etc., etc., etc. And as fun as it was, or if I did this in virtual reality and stuff, if I were to do this to a person for 60, 70, 80 years without their consent being the most important part here, even if that compound, even if that virtual reality world was so awesome and I only tweaked them and inconvenienced them mildly as far as the whole torture went, even if I threw them, only mild curveballs for most of their life, this still wouldn't be okay, right? Because ultimately, they could not escape. If the only thing they can't do is escape, it's still kidnapping. And I would be a profoundly sick and twisted individual in this scenario who ought to spend the rest of my life in confinement to ensure that I never did this to anybody else. It would be sick if you did this to somebody for 60 to 80 years, because no matter how awesome they have it, no matter how much they might enjoy it, knowing that they can't leave, they still can't leave. The only thing you can't do in this awesome place is leave, and that is still a crime. And like I said earlier in the video, there is such a stigma against checking out and suicide, and to say nothing of your own fears of literally existing as nothing, that you really essentially can't leave this sort of scenario either, and that is essentially kidnapping. But yeah, that's essentially the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and this is certainly something that I want feedback and comments on. If you guys have, if you guys think of any like points and counterpoints that I failed to mention in the video, because sometimes it is kind of hard when this is living in your head. You start to think about it in sort of fixed ways, and you don't see maybe flaws or different angles that people could take as counter arguments. But to me, I think that this could honestly be a legally viable thing if it ever were allowed to get into court, because as I enumerated earlier in the video, in the first part of part 1, essentially, a lot of the argument for natalism revolves around people reaching this false conclusion that people have to breed because the human race ceasing to exist would be so bad. And that to me is not only philosophically but objectively not arguable when you think about it, because even if the human race stops existing, it neither accelerates nor extends your own death. So, I mean, and no individual person, this is hard to explain in words, or at least with my stupid fucking brain, but what I'm trying to say is that, the ultimate fate of the human race, whether or not it ends, 20 years after you die, or 20,000 or 20 million years after you die, the ultimate fate of the human race does not affect your quality of life as you live right now. So to argue that we must continue to breed simply because the continuation of the human race is in and of itself a legal justification for something, that to me seems bunk. I mean, think about it this way. I'm going to do a thought experiment that I didn't plan here. Let's say the only 3 people left on Earth are a sterile judge, a fertile man, and a fertile woman. 3 people left on Earth. So let's say the fertile man um, wants to procreate to continue the human race, and the woman does not. Does, in that case, the fertile man have the right to rape the woman in order to produce a child because the human race must continue, and that is the most important thing above all else? Is that what the judge in this case is obligated to decide? Or let's say he's not even a judge. Let's say he's just a bystander who is sterile, who cannot breed. Does he intervene in that case? Does he stop the fertile man from raping the fertile woman? Or does the sterile man just let it happen? Because the most important thing is the continuation of the human race. And I would certainly argue that not only violates just basic principles of human rights and individual liberty, but that it really shows you that when you put it in a microcosm, the human race legally, the continuation of the human race is not in itself a justification for causing people pain or doing something without consent. And if you think that the rape would be justified in that scenario because it's just so important to continue the human race versus not have a woman experience pain, or not have a woman be violated without her consent, then I think you need to do some soul searching. But yeah, that's my fucking legal argument against natalism. I'm obviously Jesus. Your music recommendation of the week is In My Head by Gurr. I saw this band perform live a couple days ago, and they were absolutely fantastic. It's a duo of women from Germany, although they usually, almost all their songs are in English. But the title of one of my favorite songs is Klartraum, which is, that I did not pronounce that correctly, I guarantee that. But it's sung in English, but it's just like a German sort of poppy punk band that goes fucking hard. And like I said, their name is Gurr, Gurr, and their album, they have an album called In My Head, and they have an EP that just came out more recently that is called She Says. But I think my favorite track from them is on the album In My Head. But anyway, I'm obviously just see you later. Bye.